big difference between TCP/IP and the other protocols of that day. For instance, there was a competing protocol called X25, which some places still use. This was being run by the CCITT, which is now ITU, but this is a UN organization. And then the TCP/IP was kind of these students, researchers, hackers created this free protocol, and they distributed it to everyone, and it became the de facto standard. And the way that the TCP/IP protocol was managed was, instead of wearing business suits and with government and big research laboratories, they created a thing called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is a very loose ad hoc organization for creating the specification for connecting these computers on the network. Teenagers participated in the standards, and their rule was called rough consensus running code, which meant that they would kind of decide what was going on, and then they would write some software, and then they would evolve the software and develop it. So it's much faster prototyping and a very different kind of innovation, because before you had to go to university, join a telephone company, move up in the company, maybe you're 45, 50 years old before you actually get to make any decisions in the older style of this protocol development. But on the internet, with Internet Engineering Task Force, anyone can participate, and so most of the people who contributed were actually very young people, and also people who weren't in large companies. Many of them were students, and also very important, many of them were not in the United States. Although it started in the United States, many of the core internet protocols were actually developed outside of the United States, because there was no barrier for participation, because you didn't have to ask permission anymore to participate. So the key is it was open. Anyone can participate, anyone can innovate. And so, for instance, I started the first commercial internet service provider. I had to go through some hurdles with the government and so on, but once I started it, I could grow it very quickly because the licensing was very deregulated. And I think in the Arab world, different countries have different levels of regulation, and it often depends on whether you still have a telephone monopoly or not. The next big layer that was opened up was when Tim Berners-Lee, who was also trying to connect academic papers together. So there's some similarity to the scientists trying to connect the supercomputers together. And he said, let's link all the documents so that you can connect. And I don't know if you remember any of the internet before the web, but when I was using it, you could actually connect to the computer, read the research paper, read the reference, go to the other university, connect again, read the research paper. You could actually retrieve research documents even before we had the World Wide Web. And many professors actually said, oh, why do we need the World Wide Web? It's just making it kind of pretty, but it doesn't do anything new. But in fact, by making it easier and making it so that anyone could create the services, the World Wide Web changed the internet completely. And then another really important thing was Tim Berners-Lee created another organization called the World Wide Web Consortium, which is where he manages the protocols of the World Wide Web. So what does the URL mean, what does the link mean, and stuff like that. He could have patented the World Wide Web, but it would not have been nearly as successful as giving it away for free. And this was also another layer of openness. And also, if you think about it, when we first connected the networks together, it was for academic reasons. But very quickly, business email started. So if you remember, email came before the web. And by creating this open internet, we were able to change businesses completely by creating this email that everyone could communicate with a very low transaction cost. And probably most of you were using fax and telex before we had email, and this email significantly lowered the transaction cost. Similarly, the web has lowered the transaction cost a lot. I know, for instance, was talking to the Google founders the other day about how they started the business. I used to be the chairman of InfoSeek Japan. We were a big search engine. And the Google guys went around trying to sell their algorithm for search for $2 million. And we all said, no, you're just a bunch of students. So they bought a computer for several $1,000s, and they installed Linux and Apache, all the free source, open source. So before, to create the Google search engine, the telephone company would probably have run the search, so you would not be able to compete anyway. But even if you could, to create a search engine in the old computer system would have cost you millions of dollars. But for them, because all they had to do was add the algorithm, most of the stuff was open source, the computer was just a PC, it cost them several $1,000s. And then they connected to the network. Now, back before we had TCP/IP and the internet, you had to pay for each packet. And in X25, you have a bilateral agreement with every single country. And the cost of connecting Google to the network would have cost, again, millions of dollars, and they would have had to pay for all the traffic. or the users would have had to pay for all the traffic. So they got the network for free without any agreements, and a couple of students connected this computer to the internet from Stanford University, and several years later they're worth billions of dollars. Now, this is, to me, very important because by lowering these transaction costs, you're creating this explosion of innovation between it in each layer. So on top of the web, we have free and open source things like Wikipedia, and now this tag is called Tagpedia, right? And they can generate this business with a very low cost on these layers. Part of it, there are some victims because you're forcing competition at each layer. So it's good for the users, it's good for the people who build, but it's a very tough business because it disintermediates many types of people. But I think everyone can generally say that the web is a good thing for business and this internet is a good thing for business. But I remember when we were bringing the internet to Japan, many professors said, no, this internet is illegal. How can you connect to every country without an agreement? This has to be illegal. We will not allow. And we had a huge fight with the Japanese government to bring internet to Japan. And we had to fight and fight. We got no government funding. We had no university funding. We had to do it just with corporate funding. And we built the internet, and then we proved it. And the web was a little bit easier, but we're still having many difficulties with keeping it open. But the important thing that once we get past this kind of political discussion, once everyone starts to use it, they realize actually it's a good thing. But before the web, if you remember, no one knew that we needed the web. But after the web, everyone thinks, oh, how could I live without the web, right? So my hypothesis, is that we have another layer coming, which is the Creative Commons layer. And it's very auspicious that we're doing it here at Tag Legal Business, because I think that this is actually a new, all of these all lower friction. Because before, to create a, let's say, to connect the reservation system from your airline with the reservation system from your rent-a-car, you had to hire IBM and some big consulting company. It cost you $10 million in 2 years. But now with Web 2.0, you just connect the computers together. Before, the transaction cost was these, the fact that you could connect it technically, but it wasn't specified, it wasn't interoperable, so you had to do it by hand each time. And then it became simple to do. Now, Creative Commons, what we're saying is that there is a transaction cost to connecting this information. So we have the ability to connect the documents technically, but not legally. So for instance, if you publish a paper and you have a contract that says, go ahead and use this paper, and I am a publisher, television station in Japan, and I look at that paper and I say I would like to use it, I have to hire a lawyer to read it, and then we have to have a contract. And so if I'm rebroadcasting your show on television and we're at Cannes negotiating a movie deal, paying your lawyers to fly first class and negotiate the agreement and pay $10,000, it's not so bad because the deal is probably $1 million deal. But if you're a blogger or if you're a professor and you're trying to share your content with somebody else, then the transaction costs, the legal costs, especially across languages, is very, very high. And in fact, there are many cases where you would be happy to collaborate. And there are cases like Madonna or many kinds of Hollywood assets especially, which they just want to restrict and they sell. That's the business model. And we have been spending the last several decades focused on trying to protect the business models for people who have a okay with high transaction costs and are more concerned about protecting the rights rather than trying to get out there. But our argument is that there's actually many types of people who would like to lower the transaction cost. Some of them are business, some of them are academic, some of them are artistic, but people who would like to collaborate and share. Now, for instance,